Clara Jennings had lived a quiet life since her husband's passing. Each morning she walked from her small terrace house in Kent to the bookshop where she worked part-time, enjoying the smell of old paper and polished wood. The shop was her sanctuary, a place where silence spoke louder than words. On a grey evening in March, as she closed the shutters and wrapped her scarf tighter against the drizzle, she found an envelope slipped through her letterbox. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, and her name was written in a hand she did not recognize. No stamp, no address, only her name. Clara sat by the fire, spectacles perched on her nose, and opened it with care. Inside lay a single sheet. On it were just 6 words, scrawled in dark ink: "The truth of your family awaits at Ashford Lane." Her heart gave a sudden thump. She read it again and again, wondering if it was some cruel joke. Yet something about the uneven writing, urgent and deliberate, made her hand tremble. She had never heard of Ashford Lane. That night, she placed the letter on her bedside table, unable to sleep. Rain tapped against the window as questions stormed her mind. Who had sent it? What truth could they mean? And why did it feel less like a warning, and more like a summons? When the clock struck midnight, Clara rose from her bed and, with a chill down her spine, whispered to herself the name now carved into her thoughts: Ashford Lane. The next morning, Clara returned to the letter with fresh eyes. She turned the envelope over, pressing her fingers along the inside. Something stiff crinkled within. She had missed it the night before. Sliding her hand carefully, she drew out a small photograph, black and white, its corners curling with age. It showed a cottage with ivy climbing across its stone walls, a crooked chimney, and a narrow lane running alongside it. On the back, written faintly in pencil, were 2 words: Ashford Lane. Clara's breath caught. She had never seen this place before, yet the picture stirred a strange familiarity. The air in her kitchen seemed colder, as though the photograph carried with it a draft from the past. Later that day, she brought the letter to the bookshop, showing it to her friend and employer, Mr. Harcourt. The old man frowned as he studied it beneath the lamp. "It's a curious thing, Clara. Ashford Lane. I've heard the name before. Somewhere in Surrey, perhaps. But who would send you such a note?" Clara shook her head. "I've no family there. None that I know of." Mr. Harcourt laid the letter down gently, his gaze unusually grave. "Sometimes, the past finds us when it wants to be found." Those words lingered with Clara long after she left the shop. That evening, she placed both the letter and the photograph on her table, staring at them as the shadows lengthened. Something in her told her this was not coincidence. The cottage in the picture was waiting. Waiting for her. For 2 nights, Clara could not escape the thought of Ashford Lane. She woke from restless dreams, always standing before the same ivy-covered cottage. The photograph seemed to call to her from the table, as if daring her to uncover its secret. By the 3rd morning, she made her decision. Clara packed a small bag with her warm coat, a flask of tea, and the photograph tucked safely inside. She told no one, not even her daughter, Victoria, who would have insisted she stay at home. Clara wanted answers, and she wanted them for herself. The train from Kent rattled through the countryside, fields stretching endlessly beneath a grey sky. Clara watched hedgerows blur past, her mind racing. What if this was folly? What if the letter was nothing but a cruel trick? Yet deep inside, she felt a quiet certainty. At Guildford Station, she asked an elderly porter about Ashford Lane. He scratched his chin and nodded slowly. "Ashford Lane, aye. Not far from the village of Elstead. Quiet place, mind you. Folks say there's an old house there, been empty for years." Clara's heart quickened. She hired a small car and drove along winding roads lined with bare oaks. Each turn of the lane felt like a step deeper into some forgotten story. When she finally saw the crooked sign, Ashford Lane, her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She slowed, following the narrow path until the trees parted. And there it was. The cottage from the photograph. Its windows shuttered, ivy clutching its walls like fingers. The roof sagged, the door hung uneven, yet it stood waiting, exactly as in her dreams. Clara parked by the gate. The air was heavy, silent but for the rustle of dry leaves. She stepped out, her shoes crunching against the gravel. With trembling hands, she reached into her coat pocket and drew out the letter. The words seemed almost to whisper as she read them again. The truth of your family awaits at Ashford Lane. Clara stood at the gate for a long while, her breath clouding in the chill air. The cottage looked abandoned, yet there was an undeniable pull that urged her forward. Slowly, she pushed open the rusty gate, its hinges screeching as if protesting her arrival. The path was overgrown with nettles and moss, but she pressed on until she reached the front door. Up close, the cottage felt even more haunting. The wood of the door was cracked, the paint flaking, and the iron knocker hung loose. Clara tried the handle. It would not budge. Locked. She rattled it again, pressing her shoulder against the frame, but the door refused to yield. She stepped back, her heart thudding. She circled the building, peering through the grimy windows. Inside, she could just make out the shapes of covered furniture, cobwebs hanging like drapes. It had the look of a place untouched for decades. At the rear, she found another door, smaller and half hidden by ivy. She reached for it, but before she could try, she froze. On the ground, beneath the ivy, something glinted in the weak afternoon light. Clara bent down and brushed away the leaves. There, half buried in the soil, lay a key. Heavy, iron, its surface eaten with rust. She lifted it with trembling hands, the cold metal biting her palm. It was as if the cottage had been waiting for her all along, guarding its secrets until she arrived. Clara stared at the key, her breath uneven. Slowly, she turned back toward the front door. The lock seemed to wait for her. Clara's hands shook as she slid the iron key into the lock. For a moment, she feared it would not fit. Then, with a reluctant groan, the mechanism turned. The sound echoed through the silent lane like a summons from another time. She pushed. The door creaked open, a stale breath of air rushing out as though the house exhaled after years of holding itself still. Clara stepped across the threshold, her shoes sinking into a carpet of dust. The room smelled of damp wood and forgotten things. Shafts of weak light fell through gaps in the shutters, illuminating dust that floated like pale ghosts. She pulled her scarf tighter and moved forward. Each step stirred the silence. Furniture loomed under white sheets, their shapes distorted. A clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:30. Clara ran her fingers along a table, leaving a clean trail in the grime. Whoever had lived here last had left in haste, she thought. There was a feeling of abandonment, but not emptiness. Something lingered. On the mantel above the fireplace lay a cluster of papers, browned with age. Clara lifted one carefully. It was a letter, unfinished, the ink blurred as if the writer had been interrupted. The words made her throat tighten. To my dearest daughter, if ever you find this place, know that the truth of our family lies within these walls. Clara froze, her eyes wide. Daughter. The paper trembled in her grip. The writer had not signed the letter. But it was meant for her. She was certain. At that very moment, a sound echoed from upstairs, a sharp creak, like a footstep on the floorboards above. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She was not alone. Clara froze where she stood, her hand still clutching the faded letter. The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with the weight of silence. Then, another creak above her head, slow and deliberate, like someone shifting their weight across the floorboards. Her first thought was to flee, to rush out into the cold lane and never return. But something rooted her in place. The words on the letter burned in her mind, to my dearest daughter. With trembling steps, she crossed the room and placed the letter carefully back upon the mantel. She glanced toward the staircase, a narrow structure that climbed into darkness. "Hello," her voice quavered, breaking against the stillness. "Is someone there?" No reply. Only the faint sound of movement, the scrape of wood, a sigh carried through the rafters. Clara tightened her scarf around her neck and gripped the banister. Slowly, she began to climb. Each step groaned under her weight, echoing like a warning. Halfway up, she stopped, heart hammering, listening. From the landing above, a shadow shifted. It slipped across the wall, long and unmistakably human. Clara's mouth went dry. She forced herself upward, reaching the top step. A narrow corridor stretched before her, lined with closed doors. One of them stood slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness spilling through. She drew a shaky breath, her hand hovering over the door. Then, from within the room, came a whisper. A voice, faint and cracked with age. "I knew you would come." Clara's hand lingered on the door, her breath caught in her chest. The whisper had been unmistakable, too clear to be her imagination. For a long moment she stood frozen, staring at the dark gap. Then, gathering what little courage she had left, she pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, revealing a dimly lit room. Curtains, heavy with dust, sagged against the windows. The air smelled of mildew and old paper. In the center of the room stood a single chair, and upon it, an elderly woman, frail and thin, her face hidden by the fall of grey hair. Clara's heart thudded violently. The woman lifted her head, revealing eyes clouded yet piercing. "You look just like her," the woman rasped, her voice brittle as dry leaves. "So much like Margaret." Clara's throat tightened. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman's lips trembled into a sad smile. "I am what remains of this house. I am the keeper of what your family tried to bury." Clara stepped closer, her pulse racing. "What do you mean?" "My family." The woman's hand rose, shaking, pointing towards a chest in the corner of the room. Its wood was scarred, the lock broken long ago. "There," she said. "The answers are in there. But beware, child. The truth is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a weight you may wish you had never carried." Clara stared at the chest, her palms damp with sweat. The air seemed to grow colder around her. Should she open it? Clara's steps faltered as she moved toward the chest. The woman's words echoed in her mind, warning her that truth could wound as deeply as lies. Yet something stronger than fear urged her on. The chest was heavy with age, its lid scarred and warped. Dust coated the surface, thick as ash. Clara knelt, her fingers trembling as she pushed the lid open. A long groan filled the room, as though the chest itself resisted. Inside lay bundles of yellowed letters, tied with faded ribbon. Beneath them, a small wooden box rested, delicate but locked with a brass clasp. Clara lifted the letters first. The ink had bled with time, but the names were still clear. Margaret. Eleanor. Samuel. All names she recognized, her grandmother, her mother, her uncle. Her chest tightened. These were family letters, but none she had ever seen before. Why had they been hidden? She reached for the small wooden box. The clasp yielded easily, as though it had been waiting for her. Inside lay a faded photograph, a young woman standing beside the very cottage she now stood in, holding a baby swaddled in blankets. Clara's breath caught. The woman's face was unmistakable, it was her mother. But the child in her arms was not Clara. The sound of the frail woman's voice broke the silence. "They told you a story to keep you safe. But that child changed everything." Clara stared at the photograph, her hands trembling. A storm of questions roared in her mind. If the baby was not her, then who was it? Clara's fingers tightened around the photograph, her eyes locked upon the image. Her mother's smile was faint, almost forced, and the baby's face was turned away, lost to shadow. The questions clawed at her chest, questions that could no longer be ignored. Who was the child? Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The frail woman on the chair leaned forward, her bones creaking with the effort. Her eyes glistened, filled with years of unspoken grief. Your brother, she said softly. A son hidden from the world. They told everyone he had died at birth. But he lived. He was given away, for reasons too bitter to write in those letters. Clara's breath faltered. Brother. A sibling she had never known, erased from her family story. Why would they do such a thing, she asked, though she feared the answer. The woman's gaze dropped to the letters scattered across the floor. Shame. Fear. Choices made in the dark. Your family carried secrets like chains. And now, you must decide if you will carry them too. Clara's heart ached as she stared at the photograph again. Somewhere out there, a man lived, a brother she had never met, bound to her by blood and silence. She closed the wooden box gently and rose to her feet. The cottage seemed to hum around her, the walls holding the weight of every hidden memory. She looked back at the woman in the chair, her figure now slumping, as though her duty was finally complete. You will find him, the woman murmured, her voice fading. But remember, truth is both a door and a burden. Clara stood in the doorway, the cold air from outside rushing in. Behind her, the shadows swallowed the room once more. She stepped into the night, the photograph pressed against her chest. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, her life would never be the same again. The forgotten child had been found, not in body, but in truth. And now, Clara would have to choose whether to seek him, or to let the past remain buried.